Developers, here we go. Continuing to build up our knowledge of some of the building blocks that we use in variables that are going to help us build software. So we're going to open up the types file to discuss the different types of data that we're going to store in variables. Let me open this up in live server, and let me move this over to the left, and here comes my browser, and that's already over here to the right. All right, so let's let this load up, and we're going to see now. We've talked a lot about strings, so here I don't actually have a string. So let me just put my var message back in play so that we can, because we miss them. We miss that little string. So we have a string, and now we have numbers. So big difference between the strings and the numbers is there's no quotes. All right. Now these numbers, they could be whole numbers. They could be numbers with decimals, and they could be var with actually negatives. They say negative, I'm in debt $1,000, and so we can treat these as anything, any kind of number that you like. There's a limit, but there's it's really high limit. So on the right hand side we see 20, we see 20.5, and negative 1,000. So they can have whole numbers or they can have decimal places, right? Now here's another variable type. These two are, notice now, a keyword true, keyword false. These two variables are Booleans, right? Okay, so let's write that out. So we'll call them bools. You could also call them Booleans. So Booleans have one of two possible values: true or false, right? They can't be anything else other than true or false. So depending on the particular language that you have, you might also see this expressed as bits. A bit being a 0 or 1. 1 would be for true, and 0 would be for false. Now this isn't, you can't just pass around a 0 and treat it as false in every single instance. Specifically, there's actually a language out there that really terribly had these reversed when I was growing up in technology. It's really tough to work with. But good rule of thumb: 1 for true, 0 for false. Here's true, and here's false. Both these values in the graph render as false and true, right? They render almost as strings, but notice if I were to render this as, if I actually change that string to true, we're going to notice that the graph actually picks that up and it renders it with quotes, so that if you see a value here in this graph, if you see a pointer to it, you'll see that these guys are intended to be Booleans. All right. Now this comes in handy as I've named this particular variable is team member. Maybe I want to know if the data that I'm working with right now, is it reflected of, am I in the context of a particular person who happens to be a team member. Notice the naming convention. Let me zoom in on this area. The naming convention is team member, capital T, capital M. Same thing with is smoker, capital S, right? So everything is lowercase to start out with. And then the words, the second words, the word boundaries thereafter are going to be capitalized. So is team member and is smoker. There's no quotes. There's no single quotes. There's no backticks. Here we are assigning to this variable name the value of true. Okay, and so next, now we're going to talk about objects very briefly right now, because objects is a huge topic. But this is an object literal. Very much like this is a literal string or a string literal, it means this is literally just a string, right? It isn't a variable, it is a string value. Here, this is an object literal, open, close curly brackets. And because this particular object doesn't have any properties, the best thing that it can do is render itself with the keyword object here underlined. And notice that it's also under the border box here is blue. So this is an object. This is a really important data type because we're going to be able to manipulate it and add a lot of different properties and attributes to this object to give it much more meaning. But this is how you declare an object literal, and we assign it to a variable name here called an object. Next, we have an example of a variable whose value is null. So a variable whose value is null is very similar to a variable who has been left alone here. This variable is declared, but no value is assigned. And so by default, a variable that is declared and no value assigned, it receives a value of undefined. And it's not really a value, it's more of an absence of a value. Null is a value, but it's a slightly different value than no value. Okay, this is a little hard to wrap your head around. The important things for practical purposes, you can consider under really almost every use case that you're going to bump up against in the near future that null and undefined are going to feel pretty much the same way to work with, right? Which is to say I have a variable that is pointing to nothing, all right? A variable that points to nothing, there's some really important things you need to take in consideration. Very important thing is that you need to check if your variable is in fact pointing to nothing before you really try to work with it. When you try to interrogate it, to drill down into it, it's really important. You're going to learn more about that as we go on. This video here is just to show you the different possible values. So we have null, and it looks like this. Notice that null, right? It looks on the right-hand side just like it's pointing to an object. The little object graph is giving us a clue that this is a slightly different value than actually being an object. So this is an object, and undefined here is the absence of a value. So really important there as well. And so this is going to summarize the different data types that I want to review with you. You're going to leverage this knowledge later on when we actually start putting more and more examples together for you to build software.